let us begin with, as I said, how modern nation states are formed as we know them historically. It is well known but often not recognized. The counter is claimed very, very often that nation states are a very recent phenomenon. Nation states, as we know them, are a recent phenomenon. 17th, 18th century. One marker of the emergence of modern nation states is the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. So at about mid-17th century onwards, that modern nation states keep emerging. Earlier, there were empires which had within them a large number of what are today nation states. The Roman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, almost the whole of Europe was covered by these one or two or all of these empires. There was the Mughal Empire, the Mauryan Empire. All these are empires which cover different regions at different points of time. They are not coterminous with the nation states as they are today. All right. So it's very important to distinguish the two, particularly because now, as you can hear, our political leaders making these claims to antiquity. The notion of India since 8,000 years ago, or 6,000, or 5,000, or 4,000. The modern Indian nation state is a recent phenomenon, something that one must remember. Secondly, how each nation state emerges is a distinct process, and it evolves historically. A whole range of factors go into the making of a nation state. Language, ethnicity, religion, economy, geography, political history, all of them in different mixes come into the formation of a nation state. Not all nation states have the same mix. In other words, each nation state is imagined, to use the phrase used by Benedict Anderson, in a very unique, distinct way. Second thing I want to emphasize in the beginning is that the making of a nation is a process. It's not an event. It did not happen just once at some point of time and then the nation was formed. It's a process. It occurs over time. That is why our early nationalist leaders, people like Surendranath Banerjee, for example, named his book, the title was India, a Nation in the Making. That is, it is a nation in the making, in the process. It's very important to remember that it is a process, because if it is a process in the making, it also means that it can be a process in the unmaking. The last part is very, very important in today's context, because I believe we are moving in the direction of unmaking our nation. It has happened in the recent past in various parts of the world. The obvious examples are Yugoslavia, a country, an admirable country, not only in its beauty but in its conception, now broken up into 6-7 parts. You have the example of Pakistan, broken up. So nation states are not permanent. If you do not make efforts to keep the nation state, to keep the process of its making, then it can be unmade as well. How the Indian nation was imagined, I shall argue, was a product of our national liberation struggle. It was what Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India, which was imagined by a national liberation struggle that made the Indian nation state. Secondly, how the Indian nation state was imagined was very distinct. And in fact, it was unique. It's very distinct from the way it was imagined in Europe. I'll quickly like to go over the contrast, because I think it is going to be very relevant for our discussion on what is happening to us today. The European nation states emerged largely as homogeneous, one language, one religion states. Catholic France, not even Christian, Catholic France. Protestant Germany, Catholic Italy. France was a multilingual country before the French Revolution. Then it got flattened out into one language. The imagination of Germany, Italy, etc., which happens in the 19th century, are based on one language speaking people, the same language speaking people. Now, this was one important way in which the European nation states emerged. The Indian nation state was imagined exactly in the opposite manner. It celebrated diversity. As many languages as possible, as many religions as possible, as many ethnicities. It made no difference. There was no effort to homogenize in its imagination from the very beginning. It's very important to remember that. At its birth, the Indian nation state was imagined as one which was not going to be homogeneous, which was going to celebrate diversity. The greatest Tamil writer, the greatest Assamese poet, the greatest Malayalam thinker was also the greatest Indian nationalist. There was no contradiction between a regional, linguistic, and other identity and the national identity. They were complementary to each other. This is very unique about the Indian experience, which the whole world has acknowledged, which we are, as we will see, about to destroy. The second aspect of the formation of the imagination of the Indian nation state, which is distinct from the European one, was that the European nation states, the rise of the European nation states was associated with the rise of capitalism itself. And the rise of capitalism, in its inception, was also associated or was embedded in the rise of capitalism, the rise of imperialism. That is, capitalism arose with the simultaneous process of colonizing other people. Recently, a Harvard economist called Sven Beckert, I know it sounds contradictory, Harvard Marxist historian. So I said Harvard Marxist sounds contradictory, but it is not. Has, in a brilliant book called The Empire of Cotton, written this history of the early part of the rise of capitalism, which he calls war capitalism. That is, capitalism arises in Europe by letting loose war on the rest of the world, on the Americas, on Asia, on the colonies, and so on and so forth. So in other words, in the rise of the nationalism in Europe, there is an aggrandizing, suppressive element. Whereas the Indian nationalist imagination was an anti-imperialist, liberating imagination. So Indian nationalism was not an aggrandizing, suppressing, but it was anti-imperialist and liberating. This is another difference. And lastly, European nationalism emerged often by finding enemies within. Within the nation state, there were enemies. Somewhere the Catholics were the enemies, somewhere the Protestants the enemies, somewhere the Jews are the enemies. Now, the Indian imagination did not try to locate enemies within. They were not trying to locate the problems of the nation from among its own people. Now, these are very important differences. The European imagination, the logical conclusion of the European imagination, unless it was checked by democratic urges, as it was in various parts of Europe, unless it was checked, the logical conclusion was Hitler and Mussolini. Now, it is this imagination which has now been picked up by our Hindutva forces as the imagination of the Indian nation, the Hindustan idea. It is similar to this European notion. It is not the Indian notion at all. Our understanding of nationalism is not what is being sold today as Indian nationalism. It is a foreign idea which is being said this is our ancient idea of Indian nationalism. So one must be very clear about this. Very briefly, what is this imagination of the Indian nation which is being challenged today? Very briefly, I will say there are four basic constituents of the imagination of the Indian nation, which, as I said, Tagore called the idea of India. Now, there is a consensus on this basic imagination. Consensus beginning from the communist the socialists, to the left nationalists, to the Gandhians, to the liberals, the entire spectrum of Indian nationalists. That is leaving out those who were not nationalists, like the communalists and others, or the loyalists. The entire spectrum of those who were part of Indian nationalism had agreed. There was a consensus on the following basic ideas. That is, what would independent India be? What will be our nation state? The constituents were: one, it would be anti-imperialist. It would be sovereign, independent. It will not be a junior partner to somebody. It will be an independent state. Number two, very important, it will be a democratic state. The idea of India being a democracy started with almost the rise of the Indian national movement itself. As early as the 1890s, Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, is talking of adult franchise. Now you may say, so what? Do remember that the country where so many of our Indians now try to run away to, the United States, as late as the 1960s, they were still fighting the civil rights movement, whether blacks can even sit next to you, leave alone vote. Most parts of the world, women did not have the right to vote. They had to fight movements for that. Whereas in the 1890s itself, in the conception of the Indian nation, there is adult franchise. That is, each citizen, irrespective of caste, color, region, language, gender, would have equal rights, was part of that imagination. Number three, coterminous with this idea of a democratic notion was the idea of secularism. That is why the phrase secular democracy was always used coterminously, as if they're the same thing. That is, you cannot have a democracy unless you're secular. You cannot say democracy is only for the Hindus. It is not for the Muslims. And then it's obviously not democracy. So secularism is a critical part of this notion of democracy. You cannot be secular without being democratic. You cannot be democratic without being secular. This is a very important part. That is, when communalism attacks us, threatens us, it threatens not only interfaith amity, it attacks the heart of the imagination of the Indian nation, which is democracy itself. And fourthly, the last part of this imagination was a pro-poor orientation. I'm choosing my words carefully. I'm not saying socialist, though the socialists and the communists were very strong elements in the imagination of the Indian nation, but there was not a consensus on that. The consensus was on being pro-poor. From Dadabhai Naoroji onwards, his first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. You pick any early nationalist, whether it's R.C. Dutt or Surendra Banerjee or Rana Day or Dadabhai Naoroji, you will find that their basic argument is that why colonialism must go is because it causes poverty. So they start their argument from the poor. So from, as I said, people like Dadabhai Naoroji to the Gandhians to the obviously to the socialists and the communists, this notion that the poor, even to Subhash Bose and Bhagat Singh, the whole entire range of people in the national movement agreed that there must be a pro-poor orientation in their thinking. It's important because this is something that is being, again, another thing which is being completely thrown away in the imagination that we find in India today. The poor do not seem to matter anymore. Now, these four basic ideas went deep down into the minds of the Indian people because the national liberation struggle in India, the nature of the national liberation struggle was very important, that it was a long, prolonged one. It was a mass movement and it was a prolonged movement, nearly 100-year-long struggle involving the people. Now, when you involve people in a struggle, the ideas of the movement go deep down in the minds of the people. I'm making a contrast. This is not a struggle which was led just by some professional revolutionaries. It was not a guerrilla movement. It was not a coup. It was not a capture of power. by one political small group, where the people got left behind, just followed. It was a movement where the people were at the center of it. So therefore, the ideas of the movement went deep down, which meant that once the independent Indian state comes, it comes with certain parameters which are already set by history. That is, the independent Indian state must remain within these broad consensus ideas that constituted the idea of India, of the national liberation struggle. If they went out of it, then they would not be acceptable. That is why at independence in India, nobody argued, nobody. Multiple other models which were adopted by many independent states. I'll just give you two or three quick examples to illustrate what I'm saying. Nobody said that now that we are independent, let's have a semi-authoritarian rule. Let's have, let's say, a partnership between the industrial bourgeoisie and the working and the state, and promote quick development, and then we'll talk about democracy later. Now, this is what is typically the East Asian, South Korean model. Or nobody said that now we are independent, but we now need our first concern is growth and development. So let us accept a semi-sovereign position. Let us accept a junior partnership with one of the major powers. And then over time, we will become more and more independent. Nobody argued this. If anybody argued either of these, this position was what was taken by Japan, as you know. After liberation, it virtually became a junior partner to the United States for a long, long time. Now, these positions were not going to be acceptable to the Indian people at all. Nobody argued it. From the extreme right to the extreme left, nobody argued it. Nobody argued that India, now that we are independent, we should become a Hindu state. There were groups which argued it, and I will talk about that in a moment. But that viewpoint was overwhelmingly rejected by the Indian people. So the newborn Indian state was born with these four basic ideas that I have just now mentioned. If that is so, then these ideas are not very easily thrown away. 100 years of struggle, of people's participation, create a setting which is not something which is easily thrown away. As you saw, for example, one of our most popular prime ministers, Indira Gandhi, 16 years the prime minister, very popular, particularly in South India. When she messes with one of these basic principles, the notion of democracy, when she meets a challenge that is thrown to her in an undemocratic manner, she meets the challenge by declaring an emergency, another undemocratic process. The people rejected her. She was welcomed back to power much later, a few years later, within a democratic setup. So people would not accept abrogation of democracy even by their very popular leaders. It was not possible. Similarly, I'll give you an even more recent example. The BJP is today in power in the center, not only in the states, not only in Gujarat. It's in power in the center. It has majority in parliament, clear single majority and whatnot. And the BJP believes, or the BJP leaders believe, their source of their ideological inspiration, the RSS believes that India is a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu state. But are we a Hindu state today? There are pressures, there are efforts to make it, but nobody argues that India has become a Hindu state. That is one of the worries of the BJP, that now that we are in power, why is it not a Hindu state? Because, as I said, this is where history comes into play. The people of this country, the institutions of this country were built on the idea of India. And it is not easy. It is not easy to overthrow it just like that. That is why the desperation that you are seeing in the present regime. That is why they are out to attack all institutions. From the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the universities, they are out to distort the nature of civil society itself, to bring in an alternate way of thinking, alternate to the way with which the Indian people imagined themselves over a very long period of time. Significantly, but as I said, this is recent. This is not what was the how the Indian state was born. But it is very significant that the biggest challenge to the idea of India came at the time of independence itself, when the new Indian state was being born. This, even though the father of the nation, Gandhiji, a term that was used by Netaji Bose for him for the first time, the father of the nation had anticipated this threat and had explicitly laid down that what the future India would be. I will just give you one illustration because it's topical to talk about it today, in today's context. As early as 1942, when the president of the Delhi Provincial Congress Committee reported to Gandhiji the following. He reported that the RSS, in its large meetings, are giving out these two slogans. One, Hindustan belongs to Hindus and to nobody else. And the second slogan was, drive out the English first, and then we shall subjugate the Muslims. If they do not listen, we shall kill them. Gandhiji's response was printed in the Harijan on the 9th of August 1942, the very day the Quit India movement was launched, something that we celebrated just 5 days ago. That's why I'm reminding you of this, that in this very August moment in 1942, Gandhiji had very explicitly said what was the idea of India. He said, this slogan is wrong and absurd. I'm quoting him. Because Hindustan, he said, belongs to all those who are born and bred here. All who are born and bred here, who have no other country to look to. Therefore, and then he lists the smallest of the communities. Therefore, he says, it belongs to Parsis, to Beni Israelis, to Indian Christians, to Muslims, and other non-Hindus as much as to Hindus. He goes on to say, free India will be no Hindu Raj. It will be Indian Raj. It will not be based on the majority of any religious sect or community, but on the representatives of the whole people without distinction of religion. Religion, he said, is a personal matter which should have no place in politics. So you can see how topical it is. This is a lesson to be learned, to be remembered, when religion is so blatantly being misused for politics. The tallest of the Hindutva brigade leaders openly talk of a Hindu Rashtra. Now, no longer are they saying it in their RSS meetings, but in public platforms, they're talking of a Hindu Rashtra, that is a religious nation. The foundation, recently you heard, the foundation of the Ram temple was being laid, and that event was equated to, because it happened in August, it was equated to the 15th August. It was equated to the freedom struggle. It was equated to the Indian nation. However important the event, the mixing of politics was very deliberate. As you are aware, we have witnessed in the recent past Hindu majoritarian politics forced down the people's throats through the NRC, through the CAA, a combination which was bravely resisted by the Indian people, by youth, by students, by women. I'll come back to it a little later. I was lucky to be in Kerala at the time when the resistance was happening, and we will talk about it a little later. But to come back, the biggest challenge to this secular democratic idea of India that Gandhiji so explicitly stated, as I said, came at the point of the birth of the Indian nation state itself. the birth of the Indian Republic. And I'm going to briefly refer to that period, that is the period about 46 to 1950, because we are, I believe, faced with a similar challenge today. And can we learn something from how this challenge was met when the communal threat, when the threat to the idea of India first emerged at the point of independence? Can we learn something from it? And therefore, I'll go back to it very briefly. As you're aware, this period 46 to 50 was almost like what can be called a Holocaust-like situation. It was like the situation that existed in Europe in the period of the heyday of Nazi domination. 5 lakh people were killed. Millions went homeless. There were 6 million refugees as a result of the partition riots and killings and transfer of population. One of the biggest transfer of populations in such a short period of time in world history. Beginning with the 1946 Calcutta killings, we had followed by the Noakhali riots, then followed by Bihar, Punjab, Delhi, in various parts of the country, riots, killings, and throwing out of people from their homes, etc. And it was all capped. This series of events was capped with the murder of the father of the nation himself, the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. As Jawaharlal Nehru, a name that our current political leaders do not even want to mention anymore except to abuse, Jawaharlal Nehru had at that point of time seen this murder of the Mahatma very, very insightfully. He said, this is not just an act of a madman, somebody who's gone crazy and goes and kills the Mahatma. He says this is part of an organized plan. It's a part of a series of killings in order to create a situation where the nature of the state itself could be changed through a coup. And he said, this is being organized. It is an organized plan of the RSS. What they are trying to do is utilize this highly charged communal atmosphere. When, as I said, when people are being killed, when they are being forced out of their homes, their emotions are very charged. They are trying to utilize this situation to create a chaotic situation, and from that create a Hindu Rashtra, create in India a Hindu nation as a mirror image of the Muslim Pakistan. While Pakistan is a Muslim Pakistan, India will be a Hindu nation. This was the attempt. How did our nationalist leaders face up to this challenge at that point of time? As I said, 100-year-old vision was being challenged at the point of the birth of the nation itself. How did our nationalist leaders respond? It's a lesson to be learned and remembered and to be revisited as often as possible. Where is Gandhiji at this time in 1946, when one of the biggest events in world history is about to happen? That is the transfer of power from imperialism to an independent Indian nation state. After that, after India becomes independent, the whole imperial network in the world collapses. So it is a very major event. When this is happening, when these negotiations for transfer of power is happening, where is the Mahatma? He is in Noakhali, a remote part of eastern Bengal, now in Bangladesh, where riots were occurring. When the nationalist leaders rushed to him and said, Mahatma, where are you? Why aren't you here? When are you going to come back? How long are you going to be there? He said, I will be there as long as it takes. And do you know how long he was there? He was there in Noakhali, walking the villages of Noakhali, not sleeping one night, more than one night in any village, for 4 months, from November 1946 till March 1947, he was there trying to quell the riots. he said, what use is this freedom for which these negotiations of transfer is happening if the soul of India is destroyed? The soul of India to him was this Hindu-Muslim unity, the unity of the Indian people. So he is there. When, in response to the riots in Noakhali, where Hindus were being killed on a large scale, there are riots in Bihar, where an unprecedented level of killings of Muslims occur, and it spreads to the rural areas in Bihar. What does the national leaders do? Jawaharlal Nehru is at that time the Prime Minister of the interim government. He lands up with his entire cabinet in Bihar. Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, C. Rajagopalachari, J.B. Kripalani, Maulana Azad, all, and of course the local leaders like Anubhav Narayan Sinha, etc., they all land up in Bihar. And they said that we are going to stay here and use every means at our disposal, from state power to the sentiment of Indian nationalism to the personal prestige of the Mahatma and of their own leadership. Everything, they'll put their heart and soul into it until these riots stop. And they did not go out of Bihar until the killing stopped. Similarly, at independence, on the day, on 15th of August, Gandhiji is in Calcutta, again to ensure that there are no communal disturbances. He goes there, in fact, at the invitation of Suravardi, a Muslim League leader. And that is when, and not a single killing occurred on that day. And that is when Mountbatten famously called Mahatma Gandhi a one-man boundary force. Again, to remind you all, Gandhiji goes on his last fast a few weeks before he is murdered on 13th January 1948. On the plank, on the ground, that his fast is to ensure safety for Muslims in Delhi, to ensure that they are able to return to their homes, that their mosques are repaired. And he goes on to a fast, and as you know, then he gets murdered. After Gandhiji's murder, as you are aware, about 25,000 RSS workers are put in jail. Sardar Patel, who the Hindutva forces are now so desirous of adopting as their hero, was the person who actually ordered the arrests and who held the RSS responsible for Mahatma's murder as the Home Minister. What Nehru does is something that I want to talk to you about at that time. He turns the first general election in 1950. Mind you, this is just almost immediately after the riots, almost at the edge of the partition, within 3 years of the partition. At the edge of the Holocaust-like situation, there is an election where people's minds are emotionally charged. What Nehru does is turns that election, probably the only election fought on that ground, he turns it into a referendum. He travels something like 40,000 kilometers. He addresses about 35 million people. That is 1 out of 10 people he addresses directly, not through a webinar like I'm talking to you today, but he addresses directly all over the country. He travels, and the referendum, he says, today we have to make a choice between whether India is going to be a mirror image of Pakistan. Are we going to be a Hindu India like they are a Muslim Pakistan, or are we going to be a secular India? And please remind yourselves that the Indian people overwhelmingly batted for the idea being a secular Indian nation. The Hindutva parties got only 6% of the votes. All these Ram Rajya Parishad and Hindu Mahasabha, etc., all of them put together, got only 6% of the votes. They got 10 seats. That's it. the Indian people had rejected the notion of India being a Hindu Rashtra. In other words, the vision of the national movement was tested at the birth of the nation, and the idea that was being promoted by those who were not part of the national movement, but were in fact the lackeys of the British, the idea of the Hindu Rashtra that they were promoting was thrown out by the Indian people. The communal threat, in other words, was pushed back for decades. But unfortunately for us, it was not extinguished. The contrast with the response of our nationalist leadership in that period, 1946 to 51, with what happens today is something that is, I don't need to tell you, but it is worth looking at. Look at the contrast. Few miles from the national capital, in Muzaffarnagar, there are riots in which an ethnic cleansing occurs of the Muslims. That is, it is not like any other riot where you have a riot and after a while everybody comes back and there is peace. There is a riot where the Muslims from rural areas are thrown out permanently, and till today, it is several years now, they have not been able to go back to their villages. Complete ethnic cleansing. A few miles from Delhi, in Dadri, somebody gets murdered on the mere suspicion, lynched on mere suspicion of what kind of meat he has in his fridge. In Kerala, you will probably understand this better, where you have the right to eat what you want. It's a basic human right. Some of our tallest thinkers are not only bothered, but they're murdered. Kulbargi, Pansare, Dabholkar, Gauri Lankesh. Widespread lynchings are occurring in the country of Muslims and of Dalits. Everybody has seen those videos. Unbelievable, which brings our name in the world to utter shame that this is what is happening in our country. And what has been the political response? Lukewarm at best, if you compare it with the response that I just now talked about of the Gandhis and the Nehrus and the Patels and our nationalist leaders at independence. Today, even Kashmir has happened, where the democratic rights of the population of an entire state has been just taken away brutally, setting world records in curbing democratic rights. No internet for over a year. And the political class either remains silent, and a substantial part of the opposition even joins it. The inhuman negligence in meeting the needs of the poor, particularly the migrant laborers, during this COVID epidemic, again, which everybody in the world has seen. A total reversal of the pro-poor idea of India has hardly been resisted, as you know, politically. Few independent voices that speak up are harassed, false charges placed against them. Even eminent public people like Harsh Mandar, Prashant Bhushan, Professor Apurvanand of Delhi University, Vinod Dua, and so on. They are all being harassed, false charges being placed, etc. And the political class is at best silent. The NAA, the CAA, the NRC get passed. The UAPA Act, which makes even colonial repressive laws look benevolent. An act by which you can just pick up anybody and without any judicial permission, keep them in jail on the mere suspicion that they're doing something unlawful. It has not been met with any concerted political resistance. The only silver lining that we saw in the recent past was the manner in which the common people of India, women, housewives, grandmothers, teenagers, students, came out in the streets to fight for and protect the idea of India when the CAA, NRC, and NPR was seen as the last straw on the camel's back. As I was telling you, I was in Kerala at that time, and it was amazing. I've personally witnessed these marches by women on the streets. There were Catholic girls wearing hijabs to make the point that Muslims are also part of India. You know, there were so many. I mean, of course, you all have heard about Shaheen Bagh, where, as I said, grandmothers, children, everybody would participate. Where priests would come and speak, Maulvis would come and speak, Hindu priests would come and speak, Christian priests would come. So there was this upsurge from the Indian people. And what I want to point out is that how were they responding to this threat? They were responding by reading out the Constitution. And what is the Constitution but a distillate of the idea of India? The Constitution, if anybody who read any constitutional history would know, the Constitution is not written just by Ambedkar. The Constitution is written by the national movement. You only need to look at the Karachi Resolution, 1931, and you will see that how much of it has gone into the Constitution. All right. So the people of India came out with the Constitution. The images that they took up were of Gandhi, of Ambedkar, of Bhagat Singh, of Subhash Bose. They shouted slogans of unity and diversity. They talked of Hindu-Muslim unity. They talked of freedom. They talked of Azadi. And they talked of Azadi from what? From poverty, from oppression, from communal threat. That is using every idiom that I described to you of the Indian national liberation struggle. So the people responded with that. They openly rejected the majoritarian communal, what is now described as communal fascist forces that were threatening to take over the country. In fact, Nehru, again, no wonder he is disliked so much. No wonder one RSS leader in Kerala itself said that the bullet fired at Gandhiji was the wrong person. They should have fired it at Jawaharlal Nehru. Because Nehru had predicted. He said if fascism ever came to India, it would come in the form of majoritarian Hindu communalism. Now, the people, as I said, resisted on their own to this, using the idea of India. The nature of the attack is very, very important, the fascist attack. They are attacking any dissent. They are attacking the intelligentsia. The universities are the chief target. That is why I'm so proud that the Malabar Christian College, being a premier institution, has the courage to call anti-nationals Deshdrohis like me to talk. Many places they won't even dare do that. They will fear that God knows what will happen. Maybe my principalship will go. Maybe they will appoint somebody else. So let us call somebody who's a little safer. But this is the way the Nazi attack started. You all know of Peter Drucker, one of the world's legendary management gurus. So Peter Drucker wrote in a very important memoir where he described how the Frankfurt University, which there he was studying at that time, was attacked by the Nazis. And you will find the similarity between the attack on the Frankfurt University in the Nazi period and the attack that is happening on JNU, on Jadavpur, on Jamia, on AMU, and what have you. The similarities are glaring. I want to bring to your notice through this webinar a very important work where such similarities has been pointed out. It's a book called by a philosopher in Yale University called Jason Stanley, and the book is called How Fascism Works. And I'll just give you 5 or 6 illustrations that he gives of what are the key ways in which fascism works, and you on your own will see the similarities. Number one, he says, fascists create an mythic, idyllic past. That in our past, everything was fantastic. Now, you must have all have been told by everybody, including the highest leaders of the country, that in our ancient past, we knew everything. We knew plastic surgery, otherwise how did Ganesha get his elephant trunk, etc. We knew science, we knew how to fly planes, everything. Our past was this glorious past. So first you create a mythic past, total mythology. Number two, you create a victimhood of the majority itself. The majority becomes the victim. Now look at what is happening around you. The Hindus are supposed to be threatened by these rapidly multiplying millions of Muslim terrorists. And if they're not multiplying rapidly themselves, they are coming in as infiltrators, ghuspetiyas, termites, as our Home Minister calls them, termites. So there is scare, this fear of the minority is created. Now, this is not true of India. He's writing of the whole world. He's describing, in fact, taking examples from the United States itself. This is a book on how fascism emerges in all parts of the world. I just wanted to read out that, do watch it, that what is happening to us in front of our own eyes. The third, he says, is sexual anxiety, fear. Sexual fear that your women are going to be attacked. Now, what is this love jihad all about? This scare that the Muslims are going to do love jihad. The fourth is terming those who dissent from the government and the minorities as anti-national. Now, what are you seeing all around you? Deshdrohis, Tukde gang. What are all these anti-nationals surrounding them? Fifth, a vilification of the so-called anti-nationals on a massive scale, using a media, and this is a very important part of a fascist method, through a massive false propaganda machinery. Very recently, in a major article, I think in New York Times, Times Now and Republic TV were compared to Fox News, which is supposed to be the most rabid right-wing TV channel in the United States. They said that Times Now and Republic TV makes Fox News look like the BBC education channel. In other words, in their rabidness of their spreading propaganda, it is unrivaled. So through this propaganda machinery, there is a vilification of those you do not agree with. And this vilification then justifies imprisonment, expulsion, even extermination. That is genocide. And who is going to do it? This is the sixth element and a very important element of fascism. It's going to be done by what Jason Stanley says, I'm quoting, a dehumanized segment of the population. That is, you create these gangs of dehumanized people who can then commit the kind of atrocities that happened in Gujarat, for example. Murders, rapes, burning of people openly, looting. As you have seen, organizations that have been promoted who did this kind of activity are now abound. Now, this is something to be very conscious of, that here is the challenge. How a brute majority is being utilized, brute majority in parliament is being utilized to compromise the instruments of state power, compromise the judiciary, compromise the bureaucracy, compromise the media, bring in repressive colonial type laws, use the pandemic situation in which you cannot come out in the streets to protest, to suppress. Use your enforcement directorate, your income tax, your CBI, every state machinery to kill protest. Yet, the need is to resist this onslaught. The need is to resist this pestilence that is visiting our country. There is the republic, the idea of India has to be saved. The resistance has to be there where there is still space, while there is still time. It has to be done in whatever form, whichever space is available to us. We are aware, and I just now described, that large number of spaces are being closed down. It is being made difficult, but there are still places. There is still resistance possible in the families. After all, in many families, younger people have reported struggling with their parents when they seem supportive of the kind of communal ideas that have now become rampant. So, resistance within the family, within college campuses, in webinars like this, wherever there is space, and there is space in places like Kerala, the resistance must be kept up through social groups, because if it is not kept up, these spaces are going to close down. This is another lesson from the history of fascism, that if you do not utilize the spaces that you have, if you do not keep on expanding them, they shut down very quickly. And once they are shut down, then it is a very, very, very long battle to open them again. If we do not resist, find ways of resisting, creative ways. I'm not saying resist so that you get immediately killed or put in jail. That may not necessarily be the only way of resistance. But some method of resistance must be creatively found by the people of India. And I'm quite sure that the genius of the people of India, that they will discover a way of resistance. Because if we do not, if we let go now, history will not forgive us for letting go of the dream so many of our countrymen sacrificed their lives for. The dream of the idea of India, a dream which was fought for by our 100-year-old long national liberation struggle. Thank you very much.